Okay, let's apply what we've learned about elasticities to a policy example. So the one I picked here is vice taxes, and we'll get back to that in a second. I will say ManQ has three other applications of elasticities if you want to see how it's applied somewhat differently, including one on sort of long-term versus short-term oil. So vice taxes. Just in society, there's things we consume too much of that are unhealthy for us. For me, I fully admit I drink too much soda. Other people smoke too much, drink too much, or just eat too much fatty food. And there's a lot of people who are public health advocates who are trying to get us all to consume less of these unhealthy things, these vices, and improve our public health. And the most commonly suggested policy approach is to impose taxes on these vices, to just tax the heck out of cigarettes, tax the heck out of sugary drinks, tax the heck out of alcohol, and tax the heck out of fatty foods. I mean, it makes sense, right? From in a first pass, if we increase the prices, which taxes increase prices, so if prices increase, we're going to consume less of it. But sort of, there's alternate for almost all of these areas and all of our vices. There's alternatives, and part of being an economist is trying to judge. So I'll go back to when we started talking about principles, is that we face trade-offs, and so being part of being an economist is trying to judge these trade-offs and seeing what would be better, or better in a sense of not necessarily a normative sense, but what would be less disruptive to society, what will cost less, and so on. So I went and I found this is an article by a professor at the University of San Francisco Center for Tobacco Control, and he was basically making an argument that actually taxing tobacco is not the best solution. There's things that are better. And so let's actually do a little bit of his work. Well, he has some data that said if we did some alternatives, it's one of them is smoke-free workplaces here, we could reduce tobacco consumption by 29%. Another one is if we put really strong graphic warning labels on tobacco packaging, we could reduce tobacco consumption by 16%. So let's take the price elasticity of demand of tobacco at 0.4 and assume it's constant. We just want to figure out how much of a price increase in tobacco we need to see the same 45% decrease in consumption. So I'm going to go work through this example and we'll talk about it, but I would actually take just a couple of minutes and try to think how you would approach this problem by yourself, and then pause the lecture and then come back after you've worked through it. So there's a couple of different ways to do this problem. I bet a bunch of you did the midpoint rule and tried to use that. But what I actually think is easier is just to use the straight definition of price elasticity of demand. Remember, we can sort of get confused by the midpoint rule or sort of forget about it because we have the midpoint rule. But really what the price elasticity of demand is it's the percentage change in price, or sorry, percentage change in quantity over the percentage change in price. So what the problem gave us was, oh, we had the price elasticity of demand, and we had our target percentage change in price, or sorry, change in quantity. And so we can just plug that information in and get the percentage change in price that we need. So first, we needed to just do a little basic algebra here to get that the percentage change in price will equal the percentage change in quantity over the price elasticity of demand. And so now we just have to plug in our sort of information in our goal. So the goal was a 45% drop in consumption. And so what would our change in price need to be? Our change in price, well, that would have to be 45% divided by our price elasticity, which we're just going to assume is constant, which is 0.4. And in other words, we would need to have a 112.5% increase in price to cause a 45% drop in consumption of tobacco. And so it might not be directly obvious right now, but this is actually one of the sort of powerful things about price elasticities, right? We have the price elasticity of demand for tobacco, and we said, oh, well, 45%, and we have a 45% drop in consumption. Well, we could have a study and we could sort of look at different, I'm going to start right here. So this is, it's going to be a little cell. So it might be a little subtle, but this is actually one of the powers of price elasticities and why they're so useful, is that once we have the price elasticity, we can actually do this calculation for any goal we had. So let's say, in fact, our goal, we're like, okay, well, we know what we would need it when it's 45%, but what happens if we wanted a 30% drop in consumption? Well, we don't really need to do anything different, right? We just have percent change in price. Oh, come on. Well, instead of plugging in 45, all we do is plug in 30. And we get that we would need to have a 75% increase in the price of tobacco because of 30% drop in consumption. And let's just be dreamers for a second and say we want a 100% drop in consumption of tobacco. Well, what change in price do we need? For this basic example, when we assume constant elasticity, it's really simple. We just have to plug in 100% where we plugged in 45 or 30 before, divided by the same price elasticity. And we get that we would have to have a 250% increase in the price of tobacco because of 100% drop in consumption. So a couple little comments. One, I want to make it sure it's really clear. When we're talking about change in price, we're not talking about, for example, when we say we need a 112.5% increase in the price, we're not saying an increase in the tax. It doesn't mean the tax has to go up by 112. It's that the total price has to go up by 112.5%. And so the tax would have to be so large to basically more than double the price of a pack of cigarettes. Another thing you should think about is if you ever see like someone say, oh, I'm going to use the constant price elasticity assumption and try to get a 100% drop in consumption. That sort of price we saw here, this 250%, is total nonsense. It's just constant price elasticity is just not a good assumption there. I mean, I think the intuition here would be, you can think, oh yeah, as the price changes, some people will stop smoking, but there's going to be holdouts. There's going to be people whose actual individual price elasticity is a lot lower than 0.4. And so to get a 100% drop in consumption just through this tax policy, you would have to probably have, in reality, a much larger change in price, probably on the order of 400 or 500. And I don't even think you could actually get through taxes alone a 100% decrease in consumption. But people do this, you do see these calculations like this occasionally, like 100% or even like 75% drop in consumption for a vice, and they just use this constant price elasticity assumption. And that is kind of total nonsense. I mean, here we're fine, we're in econ dreamland, but if you're going to be like a serious policy analyst, you have to be a little bit more sophisticated than this. Also, I think it's just now we're sort of whenever you're an economist and you're doing policy analysis, and let's say you're going to make a normative argument that, hey, I want to drop tobacco, I want to drop consumption of tobacco, I want to cause the people to smoke less. Well, if you're going to argue for this tax policy versus the others, you have to sort of think about what's politically feasible. So here we had a 45% drop in consumption, and it required a tax that was sufficient to cause a 112.5% increase in the total price of a pack of cigarettes. Just for your reference, I know this, the largest tax increase, the largest federal tax increase on a pack of cigarettes was around 10% of the purchase price. And we're now trying to advocate for a tax policy that is 10 times that. I think it would probably, when you're doing your policy analysis, it's probably easier to try to implement the others, try to implement the smoke-free workplace and the graphic labeling on packages. But that's just a little sort of side note. This isn't really a class in policy advocacy and what policies to choose. We're trying to be positive economists and asking questions like how much of a price increase we would need to cause a certain amount of drop in consumption using elasticities is an absolutely a positive economic question. Okay, so yeah, price elasticities, they're just, I think they're just really powerful tools and underappreciated because you can get some really interesting, you can really use them for questions like policy analysis, or even if you're a business owner and sort of your idea of your elasticities, you can get an idea of changing your price, of the impact of changing your prices.